workshop here on October 22nd, 2024. Kick it right over to, is it Director Robbie or?
I think James is the perfect person to start with.
Excellent.
All right, thank you, Deputy Mayor. I know everybody received a copy of this early last week, so I'm not going to go through all of the slides in great detail, but in the interest of anyone who is watching or wants to watch the video later on, I'm going to at least try to hit on everything, and feel free as you have. If you have questions as we go, otherwise certainly looking forward to the discussion as we wrap up. So just a quick brief overview, some introductions, what some of the benefits and challenges are, some of the structures that we'll see, placed in that are related to underground utilities, and then really the meat of it, I think, is going to be what kind of considerations for policy and next steps we want to get into. So just some very basic background, when utilities first started, they actually tried to go underground, but the wire just didn't support it. The insulation around it just broke down, and so they had to go aerial. But that was kind of where they wanted to start back in the mid 1800s, and unfortunately the materials just weren't up to par for undergrounding. As far as in the city of Oshkosh, the utility poles that you see along most streets are either owned by WPS, Wisconsin Public Service, or AT&T. Interestingly enough, here in Oshkosh, it's about a 50-50 split between the two. Most communities are not that way, but that's just kind of the way it worked out here in Oshkosh. In some, about half the areas, AT&T was first, and the others it was WPS. So that is an interesting bit of how we're set up here in Oshkosh. But on those poles are a lot of other entities. Certainly as you look at any of the poles, there are several different layers of wires. You've got WPS, AT&T, Spectrum, Winnebago County, the school district, even the city, and others could all be on any of those poles. American Transmission Company, certainly, they are responsible for getting the high voltage power into the city. Their poles are generally not shared. It is them and them alone. Obviously, the images don't show up spectacular here, but this is kind of why we're here, wanting to change the look of some of these streets. And the two that I have here are two very busy streets, West 9th Avenue and Bowen Street, and there are a lot of utilities crisscrossing across those streets as you drive down them. Some of the benefits, obviously, it provides a cleaner look in the neighborhood. You don't have all of those wires overhead as you're driving around, and it also allows for trees to not have to be trimmed. Some might say butchered, but trimmed to keep them away from those overhead utilities. And that does result in generally fewer outages due to weather, animals, trees, or anything like that. Underground utilities are simply less susceptible to that kind of damage. And it does ultimately end up in a reduced operation and maintenance cost to those utility companies. There's a lot more upfront costs, which we'll talk about as we keep going, but it does give them a little bit of a benefit on the lower O&M. Also, as we have large equipment or things that may be moving through the community, it reduces the potential for conflicts. I know semi-regularly we'll get transportation companies doing oversized load, permitting to try to move through. They have to permit through the DOT, and then they contact us, and we will try to work through, getting them a route through the city to help with that. So, there are things like that having more underground utilities can make things easier for them. Looking back at an instance that happened just in my neighborhood this summer, there was a contractor taking a tree down for a property owner. My neighborhood is all aerial. They brought a big crane in, and they had to reach the crane over the overhead utilities, grab the tree, cut the top off the tree, pick it back up over the overhead utilities, and swing it back out. So they had to really work around those overhead utilities, and it resulted in a very difficult situation for them. And also, aligning with a lot of our planning documents. Several of our neighborhood association plans include undergrounding of utilities as a goal within those plans. And I know the Imagine Oshkosh plan also includes undergrounding as a goal. Again, here's some imagery of, some places that don't have overhead utilities. As you can see the note on Armory Place, those utilities are backyard. They are still aerial, but they're backyard, so the look from the street is very much the same. And then Rochefield is a much newer development where those easements were granted as a part of the platting process, so all those utilities are underground. So this look, as you compare it to those first pictures from 9th and Bowen, is very different.
James, what are the relative widths of those streets as well, at West 9th and Rochefield, which is a residential street?
Rochefield pavement width should be 32 feet in a 60-foot right-of-way, and then probably 6 or 12-foot easements on both sides of the back of the right-of-way for private utilities.
Okay. And then,
West 9th, you're really testing me there, Mark. West 9th is probably, I'm going to guess, a 40 or a 42-foot wide street in maybe a 66 at the most foot right-of-way. Because those sidewalks, in many cases on West 9th, there is no terrace or, a very, very narrow terrace. So, West 9th is, it's a wider street, but the right-of-way is not much wider. And that presented some of the challenges as that was looked at several years ago, and that, there wasn't room on the backside to get those easements. Bringing us to some of the challenges, which, I know we've talked about a lot, but, the public right-of-way is very congested with, underground utilities. Not only city utilities, but a lot of other things. City, we have sewer, water, storm, and electric for streetlights, and there are some cases where our communications fiber optic is also underground. So there's a lot of underground, and then you throw in communications companies such as AT&T, Spectrum, NTD, TDS, Windstream, Winnebago County, the school district, us. There's just so much stuff underground, and WPS gas as well. Terrace widths in most cases are not sufficiently wide for safe installation, primarily of the surface things that go along with underground utilities. So for electric, they need, places to place transformers or service pedestals, and there's just not enough room in the terraces to safely do that, in particular with transformers, because those generally will have some bigger clear space, and a narrow terrace, it's winter in particular is going to be a challenge with snow plowing and accidents. You're going to have the same issue as you do with overhead. An accident taking out a transformer is going to take out power to a lot of people, just like an accident taking out a power pole does. Kind of a graphical representation of all the stuff that's already underground within the right-of-way. So you can see there's just a lot there. And it's very difficult for anybody else to find some room to put something, or if somebody has to relay something, it's very hard to find a new spot to go in.
James, what are some of the requirements for separation, particularly with the water and sewer utilities?
The biggest thing for water and sewer is, we are looking for a minimum 6 feet clearance from our utilities. Water in particular, if we have to go out and dig a water main break in the winter, if the utilities are too close, one, they could be damaged and taken out as a part of the water leaking, but two, it becomes that much more difficult to try to get to them. So we are generally looking to keep a 6-foot clear space around our city utilities from other underground utilities that run parallel. Crossing is different. I mean, crossings are crossings. That's a lot easier to deal with than, say for example in this graphic, if WPS gas were to run parallel right over the top of the water main and we had a water main break, it would take infinitely longer to try to find that leak and repair that leak because of having to be so cautious digging around that gas main. And electric is just as challenging.
So when you say 6 feet, it's 6 feet on either side, correct?
Yes.
So, you're effectively making a 12-foot separation from everything. I'm just trying to illustrate that.
Yeah, you're looking at a clear space of about 12 feet, and those generally will overlap. State requirements are that water has to be a minimum of 8 feet separated from sewer or storm when running parallel.
There you go.
Again, that's an administrative code requirement. We've got to keep the water and the sewer and the storm so far apart, and we're trying to keep those other utilities that are running parallel with the street away, so that when we have an emergency situation, we're not causing a bigger issue with those utilities being in the way. So getting into some of the other challenges, as we mentioned, the utility companies are going to require easements outside of the right-of-way. Generally speaking, they're going to be looking for 12 foot in width, so they can avoid that right-of-way congestion. In the case of reconstruction projects versus new projects, they're going to look to the city to get those easements for them. And property owners have to agree to grant those easements. This isn't a situation where eminent domain could be utilized to obtain the easements, because it's not a public use. So it would have to be agreeable by the property owners to grant those easements. And that is a challenge that WPS has had in other cases where they're trying to underground some of their utilities, but you get one or two property owners that are, no, we're not going to grant it, and that stops their project. So that could be a similar situation on street reconstruction projects, where if you get a couple of people that are just like, no, we're not going to do it, even though we would be trying to get it undergrounded, that could stop it just because the property owners aren't going to agree to it. It does impact our design and our planning time for street reconstruction projects. Currently, we're designing projects in the spring and summer for fall and overwinter bidding. So that's our general process. We've been getting a little bit further ahead, so the utilities are getting the plans a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier. And this year I think we've finally gotten to a point where WPS may be out doing utility relocations yet this fall for some of next year's street projects. First time ever on any of our projects. So engineering division has been doing a great job trying to get just a little bit further ahead every year, and we've gotten to the point where some of those things are getting to the companies in time to start working this fall. But with easement acquisition taking a year or longer, and the utility companies needing the final plans before they'll start their design, really it means that design process is going to be starting 3 to 4 years prior to planned construction. It would just be a process change. It is similar with some of the DOT managed projects, like for example the upcoming reconstruction of Bowen Street from Otter Avenue to Parkway Avenue. That's being done through the Surface Transportation Grant Program, and the DOT is managing that project. So those have that longer time frame. So our local projects would end up having a longer time frame, similar to a lot of the DOT projects right now. As we mentioned, during new construction and new subdivisions, it's a whole lot easier to get the undergrounding done because those easements are created during the platting process. So the developer is granting all those easements before anybody else even owns the lots. So then, that challenge of one or two property owners blocking an undergrounding project doesn't exist because the developer's doing it up front.
Yeah, and that was part of my questioning, just get everybody to understand. It's like, there was a comment made to me once, well, we allow it on the west side but not on the east side. Well, on the west side, we start with 66 feet of clear right-of-way, and we can plan, we can fit everything in nice and neat. When we're kind of shoehorning in, before the meeting, you guys were talking about the different telecom companies. Well, they're just shoehorning it in all along the way, and it's just harder to plan for it because, when those streets were developed years ago, there was telephone lines. That was it. That was the only thing we had to.
Some of the streets didn't even have that when they were planned.
That's true. So anyway, but in those areas, you saw Rootfield, you saw even Armory, there's more room and there's more, it's done it all at one time, so it's better planned because you're doing it once and once only.
We talked earlier about there being fewer outages with undergrounding, but the flip side of that is they are a lot more difficult to locate. Aerial outages are usually pretty obvious where the issue is, and they can go right to the issue and start working on it. A lot of times with an underground outage, it's not that obvious, so it takes quite some time sometimes to locate the source. So while those outages are a lot less frequent, they can last even up to days before they're able to find the actual issue and get it fixed. Some of the future challenges that the utility companies have expressed to us during our meetings with them is, they don't have quite as much flexibility with underground as they do with aerial, so it does cause some risk. Kind of as an example, if you will, if we look to the wall over here on the side, you can see there's a couple of data outlets. You can vision that as being a connection point for a property. Now, if all of a sudden the property lines change and we need to put an outlet in the middle, well, when that utilities are above ground, they connect and they just they wrap it up along the existing lines and then run in at the new point. When it's underground, they don't have that flexibility. They either have to hope they have enough conduit space or dig up and put a new point in underground. So that's some of the risk that they're expressing to us, where they've got a lot more flexibility with the aerial. So that would be something that they would build into their plan to try to make sure they have enough conduit space to accommodate those changes in the future. One of the biggest challenges is going to be on streets where buildings are located, virtually or exactly right on the right-of-way line. So, here are a few examples. These are all in the Bowen Street area, but there are so many other examples throughout the city where, there's just not any room to even get any sort of an easement, let alone the, 12 feet the utilities have expressed they would need. So these are some areas that would pose some challenges to trying to get the undergrounding done. Costs that would be passed on to the city. Underground utility construction does cost a lot more than aerial, depending on the system and where they're at. It could be anywhere from 1.5 times to 10 times the cost. The utility companies would charge that back to the city if we were requiring them to underground in those areas. And they would also look to us to either acquire the easements or pay them to get the easements acquired. So depending on the project and the systems involved, it could be looking at anywhere from several hundreds of thousands to over $1 million for a project to get that completed. On the property owner side, they would have to convert their service from overhead to underground. Generally, what the WPS is telling us is they're generally seeing costs in the $3,000 to $6,000 range, but depending on conditions, that can vary dramatically. Non-residential, certainly even more. And then if the service doesn't meet standards, like, in some parts of the city there are, maybe 40 or 60 amp services. That doesn't meet standards. They would have to get upgraded to at least 100 amp service. So that just adds some more cost to the property owner for that conversion. And, as we said, those in some of the older parts of the city, that can be very challenging to accomplish. Some examples of some of the structures. These are a little bit larger. As you look at these images, certainly you would think these are, non-residential. Primarily, that's where you do see these. But even still, in residential areas, you would have to get these stepped down from a 3-phase power down to single-phase power to feed the residential areas. So there would be some of these types of structures that would need to be installed, just not as frequently as the rest of the structures we're going to be seeing. This is a little more similar to what you see in areas that have undergrounded utilities. So you've got your single-phase transformers, your pad-mounted fault interrupt transformers. So these are things that you generally will see. In most cases, every property or every other property will have one of these out front where utilities are undergrounded. Here you can see this is at least the picture on the left is taken from one of the newer subdivisions. So you can see you've got a pad mount transformer for electrical, you've got telecom, you've got, everybody's got their pedestals, and those are serving just the 2 properties right adjacent to that property line. So these are installed kind of right on the property line between the 2 homes you see in the background, and these structures would be set up at basically every other property line. Communications vault on the right hand side, that is Whereas you've got the service pedestals on the left, these communication vaults on the right are, they're put in for a lot of their mainline connections where they're bringing, a bigger service in and kind of breaking it up to go into smaller ones out into the system. So that's where these types of vaults would be installed. So moving ahead to really what kind of considerations do we want to look at or talk about? Do we want to look at, just certain categories of streets where it would make sense to evaluate undergrounding, or where it doesn't make sense? Do we look at, whether it's the street classification of local, collector, or arterial? Do we look at focusing on the gateways into the city or something else? Do we look at trying to just identify situations where it makes sense or doesn't make sense? There are some streets, take Sawyer Street, for example, at the north end, got a big wide boulevard in the middle, very wide right of way. Might be very easy in that area. But whereas we saw some of the pictures with houses close to the right of way, it's a lot harder. So do we look at just as a part of a policy, do we look at trying to identify, instead of classes of streets, maybe situations where we want to look at trying to do this? And then the funding, how will those costs of undergrounding be assumed? And we've talked, at least city manager and I have talked a little bit. We've seen some discussions about underground utility districts in some places. Don't know if it's feasible in Wisconsin, let alone in Oshkosh. That would be something, again, that would have to be, I think, more further explored to see where we would, what is legal in the state even versus, we know a lot of other states have different laws that allow them to do things that we just can't. And then next steps, where do we want to go? So I kept it kind of quick, but certainly nobody jumped anything out at there. So I guess at this point, we'll open it up to discussion. And if you want me to jump back and forth to any slides, just please let me know.
So I got a couple questions. I know that there have been some cost figures that have been thrown out, like $1 million a block. That was one that was put out there. I forgot who mentioned that to me. But I guess just what's the going rate? So if we do a Sawyer, that seems logical. It's a wider boulevard, wider right of ways, potentially maybe easier to get the easements on that as opposed to a Bowen Street. What are we looking at in terms of price? And is there some sort of grant? Is there some more sort of cost sharing? Does the state have any incentives, or just does all the burden fall on us? Or depending if we do a underground utility district, if we even can.
I don't have answers to all of that, Jacob. Certainly, let me try to see if I can remember all of that. The utilities at this point, they don't want to throw out a ballpark cost because each part of the system is very different. Right. For example, if we are only dealing with single-phase power going down a residential street, that is probably closer to the 1.5 times the aerial cost, versus if you're on kind of a little higher voltage, 3-phase main trunk line, that's going to be more towards the higher end of the cost. Certainly, I don't think $1 million a block, I don't see it being that. As an example, we did ask WPS to kind of spitball, if Wagoo had been designed that way. So that was main to mill. And there's a lot of caveats that go along with this. That they were estimating that in totality may have been around $1 million. So certainly $1 million a block, I don't see that. Yeah. But certainly, with some of the higher voltage systems, it does get a lot more challenging. I know one project that WPS mentioned to us that they're working on in Appleton, they've got a massive underground vault that's bigger than this table, so that's higher voltage, 3-phase, and it was in an easement on a property. The property owner wants to do something different, so in that case they're paying almost $1 million to move that vault.
Okay. Yeah, I figured it's not really a one-size-fits-all equation.
Yeah, it really is not, and that's part of the reason why the utilities need our final street plans so far in advance, so they can do the design and then figure out those cost differences. Okay. And the biggest challenge, generally speaking, with the underground utilities is the elevation of the storm sewer design. Because generally, electric, telecom, even the gas, they all want to be in that kind of 30 to 42 inch depth range. where a lot of the top of our storm sewers end up as well. So it's that storm sewer, profile design that is kind of the most critical part that WPS, especially even now as they do their gas designs, they're like, we need to make sure this is final before we start work, because otherwise they got to go back and redo a bunch of work.
The last question I have would be in terms of financing. Could we afford to finance this? Does the state allow us to, in statute, to finance this with some sort of, could we maybe do stormwater utility? I know that's probably not in the cards. Or does this just have to go out to bond, or just be a budget line item?
I don't have a good answer for that.
That's probably more finance, but the short answer is it depends. That doesn't help you a heck of a lot, but whenever it's something that is deemed to be benefiting private properties, then we can't use tax-exempt financing, for example. We could not use stormwater financing for this because stormwater's got to be for stormwater on down the line. There might be some cases where you could perhaps argue that you're trying to work in tandem with water or sewer or something like that, but in reality, it's going to get built into road costs more often than not.
That's what
Julie,
I suspected.
and that's.
I agree with everything you said. I think it would be hard to justify increasing stormwater rates to underground electric utilities.
Right, which are already high to begin with.
You have to put on the hat of the stormwater utility and be like, can you justify that cost being paid by those rates? So I agree with what Mark was saying.
You'll recall that, and we're still wrestling with this issue, people asked us about street lighting. And, could we do street lighting districts? And this, maybe I'm just doing too many flashbacks this late in my career, but in California, they had what they called landscaping and lighting districts. And they were specifically designed to allow enhanced landscaping or trees, enhanced lighting, and undergrounding of utilities, which was done. The challenge is that there was a case that I had in the city I worked with was the landscaping and lighting district required to get a majority of residents. Well, then they had residents, and so everybody, half the table, imagine half the table here signed on, and then this side of the table convinced one buddy on the other side to change their mind, and they literally went back to court every time this person changed their mind. And there was one person who literally kept flip-flopping, and there's a lot of insanity associated with that. But we can't find anything in the statutes that, it doesn't sound like we're finding anything that allows us nor prohibits us, so it's one of those things like, what do we do? This would be the same thing. I would, whether it's for fancy street lighting or underground in the utilities, clearly there's a benefit, and clearly it can get done in some areas. Can't be done in everything. And James and I have talked, and before James, it was his predecessor, we talked about, for example, with 9th Avenue. And maybe, James, you could show 9th Avenue just as an example, because the real visible part of 9th Avenue is those lines that crisscross the street. I think most people don't like the lines in general, but if you take a look, you can see that there's a lot of crisscrossing. If you were able to eliminate the crisscrossing, you'd end up putting poles on each side, but then you wouldn't have the crisscrossing of lines. That is a possibility too. But again, you got to put in two sets of poles, two sets of lines and everything.
Trim two sides of trees.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that one out as well, yeah.
Smaller trees.
Yeah, so, those, but then you start over again. It's like, well, these trees are too big, and then you knock them down. And at this time of year, you admire the colors and all the trees and everything, but that you also recognize more so there that the trees get chopped up to get through the power line. So yeah, it's a legitimate issue. But you can see that if you went parallel, then you wouldn't have to do the crisscrossing. And I guess probably the Bowen Street example is even better to illustrate that. But right now you see poles just on one side. If you flipped them to the other, if you did two sets of them, then you're not doing the crisscross. That's really what I just wanted to point that out.
James, if we were starting over, if we were building a city from scratch, and I know that that's probably something you don't like talking about because we're not, but if we
dream about it all the time.
If we were, what is best practices for city planning right now on, do you underground them or do you put them in an aerial What's the best
I
practice?
would, honestly, I would look to what we do with our new subdivisions, and it would be underground them and get the easements on the backside of, outside of the right-of-way, so they can be undergrounded outside of the right-of-way, and then, and the biggest reason, I should say, one of the big reasons the utilities are so adamant about getting in those easements on the outside is because if they're in the right-of-way, we have the right as the right-of-way owner to say, for the good of the public, we need you to relocate this so we can do A, B, C, X, Y, Z. When they're out there in the easements, that's our cost if we ask them to move.
Yes.
So that's why they're so important. But yes, if we were blank piece of paper starting over from scratch, easements outside the right of way, underground.
And the reason I ask is because I agree it looks so much better to not have utility poles. That's not my primary concern. I think there's a resiliency component here, especially as we think about what the weather patterns are doing and what they've started doing. And if we're already doing that for new developments, the why seems bigger than beautification, right? And so where I'm going with this is we talked about how do we set up a policy to evaluate how we do this for road construction process. It sounds like we already have a policy for doing this for new construction, right? So I think that's step one. If it's new construction, we always underground. And is that what it says?
It's a requirement, correct?
It is,
It's
yes.
it's required.
And then, for example, with the sawdust
Why don't
district.
you come up so you get the microphone?
So the people in the audience online can hear you.
So, for example, the sawdust district, we demolished all of those buildings and we started from scratch. So we had the easement area for the public utilities. So redevelopment spots too, we're doing the same thing, and new construction.
That's perfect. So
Yeah.
when we look at things, like we look at infill lots, so I know, and at my house, I know that in my neighborhood, there are aerial poles, they're going into people's houses. Like, I don't know where in their house, but in their house. My house, it goes underground and then into the house that way. For new construction, for infill lots, do we require undergrounding utilities into the homes?
I don't know if we necessarily require it, but it's pretty much industry standard that everything is underground.
Okay, and so I think that would be the second policy consideration that maybe we could add to a list, and I'm not speaking for everybody, I'm just brainstorming. But if we are thinking that maybe in the future, for road construction projects, we're gonna require undergrounding utilities, saving the homeowner that $3,000 to $6,000 down the line, because your utilities are already entering the house underground. And then I think maybe the third consideration is where, James, you were going, of what's the feasibility here, what's the cost, and what is the rationale? So as you look at the arteries into the city, number one, it's hard to find our downtown as you're driving down 41. You have to get there. I think encouraging people that it's a beautiful way, the whole way downtown is a nice thing. So we should look at that. And those are typically wider streets. I mean, that's why. So I would hope that there's more opportunity there. But do I understand that wrong? That the wider the street, I would think there's more opportunity for undergrounding utilities, or is that not oversimplifying it?
It might be a little bit, especially with the utilities wanting to get outside of the right-of-way in those
Yeah.
easements. So that's where, West 9th Avenue would be very challenging. I mean, it's kind of hard to see on this picture, but, if you look at, there's a couple here that are further back, but you can see up here that some of these buildings are only 5 to 8 feet off of the back of the right-of-way line. So, there would be some challenges to doing it, but, you're right, the gateways are the ones that would make the most sense, and that's, Kelly and I have had a lot of conversations about that over the years about, how can we, do this on the gateways, and some of them I think will be easier than others.
Yeah. So I think it's coming up with that standard. Maybe that's your question to us.
That is some of my question to
Yeah.
you, is what kinds of things do you want us to try to look at and get more information about?
I think, and I'll give up the microphone, but I think mine is two things. It's beauty, like that's going to exist no matter where we underground it, it's going to look better. I just think that that's a natural result. That's not the why in my mind. I think number one would be for resiliency purposes, where can we find grant money, either the federal level or the state level? I would imagine that the infrastructure bill would have something for that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I know we're still trying to fully understand that. But if we focus on resiliency only, are we able to find funds to do this work? And then the second thing, which is also resiliency related, where do we see common problems as a city in terms of outages, whether it is electrical or otherwise, and why is that? It would be the purpose, and I don't know what that could be. You all would understand a lot better than us, but to the extent we're seeing a lot of problems and people are losing hundreds or thousands of dollars a year because of outages for whatever reason, I'd care about that. Internet is a great example. I know that doesn't seem like it's going to cost you a ton of money. I work from home full time, so if I don't have internet at my house, I have a big problem. My boss has a big problem. So anyway, resiliency is, I guess, would be my focus, and so that's what I would ask us to structure this around.
It's interesting that you bring up the resiliency point, because as we've had discussions about how natural disasters are impacted with climate change, we haven't seen it here, but I would say we haven't seen it here yet. One of the biggest challenges I've seen are when power lines get ice on them and then they break. We don't have a lot of that here, but is that coming? You talked to Chief Smith, that was very common in Virginia. And, and I'm sure down in Louisville.
Kentucky was probably, ice storms were a big deal.
That's a big deal there, and is it coming north? And so it's a valid point. Most of, and I'm talking from not from any specific data, but I just think from our experience, the areas that get hit are the overhead lines in town, when they do get hit. Because as James' slides point out, the undergrounding, much less frequent. When they're down, then you gotta figure out where it is. That's a challenge, but they don't happen nearly as much. So the ones I've seen anecdotally have been overhead lines. And James?
And certainly WPS, they know, they have GIS mapping of those types of situations. And, that's what leads them a lot of times to some of the projects that they're initiating to try to underground. They relayed a story to Mark and I when we met with them of some projects they're doing in Green Bay because of that exact same reason. We have a history of outages on this aerial line. One neighborhood, boom, first shot, they got it done. Another neighborhood, they've tried 3 times and been shot down by the neighbors saying, we're not giving you the easements. Sure. So that's, but they do look at that and they do have that information, at least from the electric side of things. I'm not sure on the telecom companies if they have that, but I know WPS has that.
They have heat maps for outages. I'm sure they probably do as well if they're trying to identify risk areas.
Yeah.
They must. I mean, just looking here on a quick Google search, there's a FEMA grant for resilient infrastructure. It's called the BRIC grant, and there's about, in 2022, they made about $2.2 billion in awards. So, to DJ's point, there has to be something out there. I'm sure that with the infrastructure bill, there's something else out there too. And I would be more than happy to take a look at kind of the front doors of the city. I know that's something that the chamber complains about every now and then, is that, look, we're trying, there's the beautification aspect. We can start with places like South Park and then coincide with the other projects we have going on, such as the Parks Department trying to beautify those kind of right-of-ways, especially at South Park near the airport. But if you're looking for direction, something that I would mention is hotspots for outages. And then if we can get the right-of-ways, those kind of main thoroughfares and arteries, we already have a policy for new development, which is great. And then clarifying anything on infill if we need it.
James, I'll chime in quick. Joe and I talked about this lots, and this is part of the direction. I agree with what everybody's at so far. Resiliency is a really great place to start. Some of the consideration here, you read the same things I read, and what Joe and I have been talking about for the last year, we've been talking about this. The weather is an interesting point. We're at this cusp of the overhead things might be more expensive in the long term right this second than undergrounding might be for the initial cost. So as we evaluate prices, we'll get there anyway. I'm easier than everybody because I'm just glad that, I'm grateful for the presentation. This is great. And Wagyu is a good example because I was the thorn in Wagyu for a minute here. But with the folks there, it would have been impossible. It would have been too expensive, and we get that in hindsight.
And probably the easement
would have been really, really, really hard. I get it. But what those folks who were asking wanted was the ability to hear that up front. So whatever we do, we're going to have that option going forward. And I think that's going to be wonderful for the folks to at least know why they can or can't. So I'm just that easy. I want someone to have the option and to know what it costs and why we will or we will not do it. Which is great. And we're already there, I think, which is perfect.
Yeah, and I think I line up with Jake and DJ quite. I think we should identify a handful of corridors that we're going to really commit to underground. I think that's, I'm more than willing to spend a little bit of money on those corridors, those entrance into our community, and then maybe the other places we come up with a policy that says we're going to look at it. We talk about it if it's completely financially infeasible or completely the way the street is, the width is infeasible, we're not going to do it. I do like I had never thought of the back, so I have utilities in my backyard and my front yard. I have wires coming out my house.
I do too.
Everywhere, sure.
So you don't have high-speed internet, or you don't have, you don't have the internet.
Yeah, I don't either. But I mean, I guess, is there, when we redo a road, I mean, is there ever any consideration of, hey, can we take all the front lines and push them to the back? Is that ever something we've done? Or I noticed that my backyard lines are a little smaller. I'm not good on utilities, you know.
Yeah, I'm not sure how your neighborhood is. In my neighborhood, I get electric from the front. When I was a Spectrum, Time Warner at the time customer, that came from the front. AT&T comes from the back.
Okay.
You know, so those easements might even be to the point where they're only allowing this company to use them.
Sure.
When we do new subdivision plats, it's not that restrictive. This is an easement for all utility companies. But some of them might, you know, I know some of the older plats said, this is an easement for WPS, or this is an easement for AT&T.
Sure.
You know, so that poses some challenge to try to move some to other locations.
Yeah, I guess the only reason I bring up that is maybe that's a solution that we look at in the future. We keep them above ground, but we try to consolidate in the backyard. I guess everybody has a different aesthetic. I would prefer them in the backyard, but maybe someone else hates them in the backyard. I don't know, but I think that's where I would like to go with this. I'd like to identify some corridors where we're going to really try to make sure we have underground, and then come up with that policy moving forward that says these are the situations when we could do underground. We're going to look into it. It's nothing that's going to tie us to that if there's weird situations we run into.
All right, we know 3 to 4 years in advance. I mean, I know it takes a little bit more time in planning to evaluate whether we can or can't, but it sounds like the utility companies give you lots of leeway, and you've got many years to know whether it's hard or easy, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things, you know, obviously looking at the streets we've got programmed now, you know, we could look at, okay, well, we're not going to look at, you know, next year or the next 2 after that, but we could look at year 4 and say, okay, what are these streets? I don't know them off the top of my head.
Yep.
Justin might, I don't. But we could look at those streets and say, you know what? We got houses, or we got structures, you know, right up to the right of way throughout this whole, all right, we're not going to look at that one. And, you know, maybe we do find one that might be feasible, so then, you know, we end up starting that design process earlier on that one.
And I know private utilities have more authority than I would like to give them, but are we allowed, I know they prefer a private easement. If we have a very large right-of-way, I mean, can we say, no, you're not going to get a private easement, you're coming into our right-of-way, we're going to play nice in the sandbox and share? Do we have authority to dictate that or no?
Good question. Not 100% sure on the answer to it.
Sure.
You know, Justin.
I can't say that I can 100% answer that question, but I know in dealing with the Sawdust District, specifically, we were trying to get them in the right-of-way in lieu of doing the easements, instead of dealing with us as the city, RDA, the developer. It was just kind of a mess. We were trying to say, we're going to do this underground, we want you in the right-of-way, and they flat out said no.
Okay.
So we've had that process once, and we've gone down the easement process, so I don't want to say, no, it's a never, they're not going to do it, but they're really going to push for the easements.
Okay.
I think to that point, I think it'd be super helpful if we can ask someone in maybe it's the attorney's office to tell us what we are required, or what we are able to dictate and what we aren't, so that when they said no to us, are they allowed to assume that they are allowed to? And then maybe we should work as a city with our state officials to change that rule. Because if we as a city can actually dictate to these utilities, no, if there's a public right-of-way, you got to put it there, that would be super helpful to, I think, solve some of these problems. The only thing I would also add to what Joe said about the corridors coming into the city, the only additional thing would be, as we consider growth outside of the city, to determine what those lines are, where if they were downstream and they were damaged, they would affect the developments outside of what's developed today, if that makes sense, so that we can advertise ourselves as a resilient city, especially as climate change continues and data centers in Texas are looking for cooler places to be, for example. Just determining kind of what those crucial lines of infrastructure are, and I guess focusing on those lines, even if they are in a more difficult place to underground.
Yeah, I think, you know, generally, you know, speaking again from the power side, I know WPS generally is trying to make sure that they are I'll use the term looping their systems, much like we do with our water system. Because they recognize the risk of having, just a chain going out that doesn't have any other connection points. So generally, they are trying to build that into their system, but there may be places where, I'll pick 9th Avenue, where maybe they're not interconnected, and if there was an interrupt, somewhere on 9th, it might take out more. I don't know, we could certainly try to work with them to try to identify some of that.
Yeah.
I don't know, I just don't have a great opinion one way or the other. To me, and it's interesting because, you see the pictures of this, and when you look at them, they stick out like a sore thumb. But when I'm driving, I never notice them. I don't see them. And so I'm looking at a cost-benefit analysis here, and I think the dollars, the efforts, the lawsuits, the neighbors, all that stuff, I just don't see a lot of why you want to get involved. I mean, if it's a gateway or something, okay, then that would make more sense. But to try to go through all these hoops to do this, I think the reward is not worth the dollars that we're looking at doing here. And the grants and all that, that's nice, but the reality is those are tax dollars. I don't care if they're coming from here or Madison or the federal government. I think government really needs to wean itself from those types of dollars to begin with. So I don't know. I mean, whatever we do. I just don't. I guess I just don't really have a big opinion on one way or the other.
One of my favorite sentences is I agree with Paul on this. I honestly wouldn't have been able to tell you where they're undergrounded and where they're above grounded, from driving in. But that's just me. Aesthetics mean nothing. The resiliency of the system does matter to me. If we're going to put ourselves in a situation, though, where a potential outage is 2 to 3 days or 1 to 2 days, that's catastrophic versus, a couple hours already feels bad when you don't have Wi-Fi or, it can feel bad, but a couple days, that turns into a potential emergency. The other thing the biggest number that jumped out at me in the whole presentation is that it can cost a private homeowner $3,000 to $5,000, $3,000 to $6,000 even, to be able to get their house ready to accept those underground utilities. And that is I've had hard conversations as city council. I've supported a lot of what we've done here, and I've been glad to go out there to the community and be like, no, this is why we need to do this. That would be one that's really hard for me to stand up and say no. For the same service you're already getting, but hey, you don't have a pole in your front yard, it's going to cost you this. That's going to be really hard for me. So overall, though, I think you got pretty good direction that the new development, stick with undergrounding, evaluate where you can. I don't want to see it pushed above the priority of maintaining a fiscal budget and making sure that our system is reliable and coherent.
Okay. I think what we normally do with these workshops, we come back in a few weeks and everything, and I'll ask staff to kind of combine all these notes, some commonalities. I mean, we heard about corridors and things like that, but trying to get some of these other ones that, maybe one of you mentioned, but not others, and say, are those things that the larger group wants to consider, to come back, so we can get some policy direction from the council on where you want to go. Thank you for reading it in advance, so James didn't have to read all the slides, and appreciate you studied up for this and came and asked great questions, so that I think that helps with us. So we'll work on this and come back in a few weeks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, James.